What if everything you think you know about World War I is a lie of omission? A story carefully trimmed to hide the one truth that would shake your entire understanding of how nations actually fall. What if the war didn't begin because a man was shot, but because entire empires were already collapsing in silence? Buried under debts so enormous that a global conflict became the only way to reset the system without admitting failure. Most people imagine 1914 as the moment Europe lost control. But what if Europe had already lost control decades earlier? What if the gun in Sarajevo was just a spark thrown onto a financial powder keg built from 650 million pounds of British debt, French and German borrowing frenzies, and an Ottoman Empire so bankrupt it had already surrendered its tax system to foreign creditors? Now here's the part that unsettles everyone who hears it. For the first time, the war didn't erupt out of chaos, it was engineered by mathematics. The empires weren't fighting for glory. They were fighting for solvency. They were fighting to survive interest payments they could no longer afford. Peace wasn't the safer option. Peace was the threat that would expose the insolvency rotting them from the inside. And once you see the crisis beneath the gunfire, you can't unsee it. The trenches, the alliances, the feverish mobilization, they weren't the cause of disaster, they were the escape plan. War didn't ignite the collapse. War delayed it long enough for governments to rewrite their debts and pretend the foundations hadn't already cracked. This isn't the version of history you learned, but it's the version that finally makes the whole thing make sense. The slow collapse didn't begin in 1914. It began half a century earlier, when Europe discovered a dangerous new shortcut to power. Instead of conquering territories and waiting for revenues to grow naturally, empires learned they could borrow their way to dominance. Britain was the first to embrace this strategy, using vast loans to lay railways across India, build naval bases on 6 continents, and sustain the most far-reaching military presence the world had ever seen. On paper, it looked brilliant. Every new colony promised new tax streams, new trade routes, new justifications for the debt that financed the expansion. But behind the pageantry of empire, the numbers were tightening like a noose. By the eve of 1914, Britain's national debt had swollen to 650 million pounds, a figure so large it required meticulous interest management and constant refinancing just to keep the machine running. Germany watched Britain's rise and refused to fall behind. Under Kaiser Wilhelm, borrowing exploded as the nation rushed to challenge British naval supremacy and carve out its own colonial footprint in Africa and the Pacific. Every ship, every railway, every outpost was funded on the belief that the future would pay for the present, that tomorrow's conquest would cover today's loans. France and Russia locked themselves into the same race, expanding armies, fortifying borders, and stretching their treasuries to keep pace with the rivals who were also drowning in borrowed money. Europe wasn't competing in an arms race, it was competing in a debt race, each empire pushing the others deeper into obligations they could no longer escape. The warning sign came early, but no one wanted to see it. In 1875, the Ottoman Empire collapsed under 200 million pounds of debt, forced to admit bankruptcy and surrender more than half of its national revenue to foreign creditors. European powers didn't just demand repayment, they took control of Ottoman tax collection through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, turning a sovereign empire into a financial ward of European banks. It was a glimpse of what awaited any nation that fell behind in this credit-driven competition. But instead of pulling back, the great powers marched forward even faster. By the turn of the century, the pattern had become unmistakable. Nations borrowed to expand, expanded to justify borrowing, and borrowed again to maintain the expansion they could no longer afford. The entire continent was running on the same fragile logic: keep growing or collapse under the weight of unpaid interest. What looked like geopolitical ambition from the outside was, from the inside, a desperate attempt to outrun the arithmetic of debt. Europe had built an empire of obligations, and the ground beneath it was beginning to shift. By the early 1900s, something subtle but enormously dangerous had taken shape beneath the surface of Europe's political alliances. The treaties everyone learns about in school, the Triple Entente, the Central Powers, the grand diplomatic arrangements, were only the visible layer. Beneath them was a second network, quieter, more binding, and far harder to break a web of shared credit commitments. Nations weren't just aligning their armies, they were intertwining their balance sheets. And once that happened, their financial survival became inseparable. The turning point came with the Declaration of London in 1914, a moment that history books treat like a footnote, but which, in reality, made the financial logic of the coming war official It acknowledged openly what had been developing behind closed doors. Credit itself had become a strategic weapon, and access to it was now a core element of the Anglo-French-Russian alliance. To join the group wasn't merely to promise military support, it was to promise that your economy, your borrowing power, and your future tax revenues would be tied to your allies' fortunes. If one nation stumbled, the others were obligated to help carry its debt load. This wasn't the mutual defense, it was mutual financial dependency. When you step back, the picture becomes unsettlingly clear. Every major European power was already struggling with mountains of debt accumulated through decades of territorial expansion. But because each nation knew its rivals were in the same position, backing away from expansion became impossible. If Britain slowed its borrowing, it risked losing naval supremacy. If Germany paused its buildup, it fell behind. If France or Russia stopped pushing outward, they invited geopolitical vulnerability. Everyone was locked in the same escalating cycle: expand to service debt and borrow to expand. The alliances simply fused these pressures together. This is where the hidden mechanism reveals itself. The alliances didn't form to prevent war. They ensured that once conflict began, it would be total by tying their credit systems together. The great powers created a scenario where peace became the real threat. Peace meant facing the math. Peace meant confronting the insolvency that expansion temporarily concealed. But war offered a narrative, a justification, a political shield behind which governments could borrow sums that would have been unthinkable during peacetime. It allowed nations to delay the reckoning, to reach for the illusion that victory and plunder might solve the crisis that compound interest had created. In that sense, Europe didn't slide into war because diplomats failed. It marched into war because its financial structure demanded motion forward, outward, anywhere but still. The alliances were not just military commitments, they were the scaffolding of a debt-driven system that could no longer sustain itself without a dramatic break. War became the only lever left to pull, the only strategy that kept the machine from collapsing under its own weight. Once the war began, the numbers shifted from dangerous to impossible. What had started as a competition of imperial budgets turned into a financial freefall, and Britain, already burdened with £650 million in debt, found itself carrying not only its own war costs, but the costs of its partners as well. By 1916, the British government was financing enormous portions of the entire Allied effort, the lion's share of the empire's expenses, all of Italy's war spending, and nearly 2/3 of what France and Russia needed to keep their armies alive. One country was effectively underwriting a world war, and the strain pushed the financial system past anything it had been built to withstand. This is where the mask drops and the math takes over. Wartime borrowing doesn't grow in a straight line. It spikes like a detonation, with armies burning through resources at unprecedented rates. Governments had to borrow constantly just to maintain the flow of weapons, food, and manpower. That surge in borrowing drove interest rates upward, and rising interest rates transformed what began as a geopolitical struggle into a financial trap. Every additional pound borrowed demanded future revenue that no peacetime economy could provide. The only path that made sense inside this grim arithmetic was expansion territory. Resources, industrial output, anything that could generate enough income to service the debt that kept the war machine alive. Victory, in this environment, stopped being a matter of national pride and became a matter of national survival. If a country won, it could seize enemy land, claim resources, and secure the reparations needed to stabilize its accounts. If it lost, the consequences were catastrophic default on international loans, exclusion from global credit markets, and a level of foreign financial control that had already been imposed on the Ottoman Empire in 1875. Governments looked at that example and saw their own futures if they failed. Defeat didn't just mean humiliation, it meant bankruptcy. This is the hidden logic that makes the brutality of World War I easier to understand. Even if it becomes harder to accept, nations weren't fighting simply because they hated one another or because alliances demanded loyalty. They were fighting because the financial structure behind their empires had reached a breaking point, and war provided the only political cover for the borrowing required to keep their economies from collapsing outright. Peace, ironically, was more dangerous. Peace meant facing the numbers. Peace meant admitting insolvency. So the war dragged on, fueled not just by armies and ideology, but by balance sheets that could no longer sustain stillness. It was violence driven by mathematics, a debt reset paid for in human lives. The deeper the war dragged Europe into financial quicksand, the more a new power, one far from the trenches, began to shape the outcome. And at the center of that shift was a man who never set foot on a battlefield. Picture J.P. Morgan Jr. in 1915, seated in his Wall Street office surrounded by maps of Europe, each marked with pins where British, French, and Russian armies were burning through supplies faster than their governments could finance them. To most Americans, the United States was still neutral, but Morgan was already orchestrating a financial network that would make that neutrality impossible. That same year, Morgan created a syndicate of 200 American banks, an unprecedented coalition to float a $500 million loan to the Allies. It was the largest foreign loan in history up to that point, and that was only the beginning. As the war intensified, Morgan's loans would swell to $1.5 billion, a sum that would equal tens of billions in today's dollars. But the money itself wasn't the real power. The real power came from the strings attached to it. Every British munitions purchase had to go through Morgan's firms. Every French artillery order, every Russian rifle contract, same route. An American banker, operating from Manhattan, had taken control of the Allied supply chain long before the United States fired a single shot. Once you understand that, the next twist becomes inevitable. If the Allies fell, Morgan fell, his banks fell, and the 200 institutions tied into his syndicate fell with them. The U.S. financial system was now exposed to the largest geopolitical gamble in modern history. America's fortunes were no longer separate from Europe's survival. They were woven into the same web of loans and interest payments that had already ensnared the empires across the Atlantic. Neutrality, at that point, was a luxury the math no longer allowed. Meanwhile, a new force had quietly taken its place in the American financial landscape, the Federal Reserve, created in 1913. With the Fed's ability to expand the money supply and coordinate national credit, the United States suddenly had the infrastructure to fund the war on a scale no private network could match alone. What began as Morgan's private gamble morphed into a hybrid system of public and private lending, one that would soon transition into full government-to-government financing once America officially entered the war in 1917. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, the transformation was complete. In just 4 years, the United States had gone from a net international debtor of $3.2 billion to the largest creditor nation in the world. European empires that had once dominated global finance now owed their survival to American capital. And Wall Street, acting through Morgan, through the Fed, through the unprecedented flow of wartime loans, had become the invisible hand steering the conflict from an ocean away. The narrative flips here. America didn't join the war because of ideology or outrage alone. It joined because its financial exposure demanded it. The United States didn't simply save Europe, it replaced it. When the guns fell silent in 1918, the world expected peace. What arrived instead was a financial machine more enduring than the war itself. The battlefield ended, but the balance sheets did not. The Treaty of Versailles looked like a peace agreement, but in practice it became the largest debt collection system ever engineered, one that locked Europe into a cycle of payments, loans, and obligations that would outlive the very empires that signed it. Germany was ordered to pay massive reparations to Britain and France, but the defeated empire didn't have the money, and the Allies didn't have the luxury of patience because they, in turn, owed staggering sums to the United States. So, a strange, almost surreal loop emerged. American banks loaned billions of gold marks to Germany. Germany used those American loans to pay Britain and France. Britain and France then took that same money and shipped it back across the Atlantic to repay their own debts to the U.S. Treasury and to American financiers. On paper, the system looked functional. In reality, it meant Europe wasn't rebuilding. It was refinancing. Between 1919 and 1932, Germany paid 19 billion gold marks in reparations while receiving 27 billion in loans, mostly from the United States. It was a circular river of money, flowing endlessly, but never filling the reservoir it was meant to restore. And while the amounts moved across borders, the consequences sank into the lives of ordinary people workers, farmers, families who had never stepped foot in the trenches yet found themselves paying taxes for a war that had ended before they were even born. The debts lasted not years, but generations. The absurdity becomes clearer with distance. Britain didn't finish paying its World War I debts until 2006. France kept paying until 2009. And Germany, the nation held responsible for the conflict and forced into the most punishing obligations. Didn't make its final payment until October 3rd, 2010, 92 years after the armistice. Nearly a century of citizens funded a war their great-grandparents fought. Their grandparents barely understood, and their parents only read about in schoolbooks, while nations struggled beneath the weight. The banking institutions behind the system only grew stronger. The war toppled monarchies, redrew borders, and ended empires, but it solidified a new hierarchy, one where financial power outlasted political power, and where creditors, not governments, dictated the terms of Europe's future. In the end, the story of World War I wasn't just written in trenches and treaties, it was written in ledgers. And the final lesson is as unsettling as it is simple. The nations may have fought the war, but the banks won it. They thought they were safeguarding their empires, but the empires were already hollow, propped up by borrowed money, borrowed time, and the illusion that expansion could outrun arithmetic. The soldiers in the trenches believed they were fighting for their flags. The truth buried beneath the mud was that they were fighting to keep their governments solvent. Every advance, every retreat, every casualty was measured against interest payments accumulating in distant banking halls. When the war ended, the world looked for victors among nations, but the nations were broken. The true winners never held a rifle or stood in a trench. They were the creditors who shaped strategy without commanding armies, the institutions that turned catastrophe into revenue and insolvency into influence. Monarchies collapsed, empires disintegrated, millions died, but the financial architecture behind the conflict emerged stronger, more entrenched, more unavoidable. This is the quiet victory. History rarely names the triumph of a system that converts crisis into opportunity and war into a balance sheet correction. World War I didn't just redraw borders, it redrew the hierarchy of power. It proved that debt could guide diplomacy, trigger conflict, and outlive every government that signed the papers. And the pattern hasn't disappeared. It persists because the design is self-reinforcing. A world built on debt requires tension to justify borrowing, requires instability to maintain control, requires crisis to keep the gears turning, remove the crisis, and the system exposes itself. Maintain the crisis, and the system survives. That is the legacy we inherited, not just a century-old war, but the machinery that made it inevitable in a world ruled by credit. Peace is fragile, conflict is profitable, and the most decisive battles rarely happen on the front lines. They happen in ledgers. In the end, the story of World War I reveals something far more unsettling than a clash of empires. It exposes a world where nations march not toward glory, but toward the only escape their balance sheets allowed. By 1914, Europe's great powers were already trapped, Britain buried under £650 million in debt, Germany and France locked in escalating borrowing, the Ottoman Empire bankrupt and stripped of financial sovereignty. The war didn't create this crisis, it masked it. Victory meant resources to service impossible debts, defeat meant bankruptcy, foreign control, and national unraveling. And when the fighting stopped, the trap only tightened. Germany borrowed from American banks to pay Britain and France, who turned around and paid the United States an endless loop that lasted decades. Britain didn't finish paying until 2006, France until 2009, Germany until 2010. Nearly a century of citizens funded a war they never fought. What this reveals is a truth almost too uncomfortable to accept. The empires fell. The borders changed. The soldiers died, but the financial system that engineered the crisis survived untouched. It outlived monarchies. It outlived ideologies. It still shapes the world we live in. Because this wasn't just a war, it was a demonstration of a deeper architecture, one where debt flows upward. Sovereignty bends to credit, and the real victors are never found on the battlefield. If you're ready to explore the parts of history built on ledgers rather than legends, the forces that shape nations long after the treaties are signed, stay with us. The story of World War I is only the first door. The real pattern is much bigger and it's still unfolding.